Remember back in the early days of COVID? I mean, everyone was just glued to the news like 204/7, trying to figure out what was going on.
Yeah, it was a crazy time for sure.
Absolutely tons of information coming out every day. And honestly, a lot of it just turned out to be, well, wrong.
Yeah, a lot of misinformation floating around.
Exactly. It was
Yeah.
really overwhelming to try to sort through it all. And one of the big things everyone was talking about, hydroxychloroquine, HCQ. Some people were saying it was going to be like a miracle cure.
Right, HCQ was all over the news back
It
then.
really was. So today we're going to do a deep dive on a study about HCQ that had to be retracted. A retraction
Uh-huh.
study that, get this, is the second most cited retracted paper ever.
Wow, that's something.
Yeah, it's a really interesting story that shows just how complicated science can be, especially during something like a pandemic. And it reminds us how important it is to be really careful about the information we share, especially when it comes to people's health.
You're absolutely right. Retractions are not that common in science, and when a paper does get retracted, it's a big deal. It usually means there were some serious problems with the research.
So let's go back to early 2020, like right when the pandemic was really kicking off. Everyone's looking for anything that might help, any treatment that might work. And that's when Didier Raoult comes into the picture.
Oh, yeah, I remember him.
Yeah, he was this French researcher who became a huge advocate for using HCQ to treat COVID. Basically, he was saying that HCQ could be the answer.
And his research, especially the study we're going to talk about today, made him pretty famous, at least for a while.
In that study, it claimed that HCQ actually worked. Like it said it reduced the amount of virus in patients who had COVID.
It was published in a well-known medical journal, too, the International Journal of Antimicrobial Agents.
So you've got this well-respected researcher, a study that seems to have good results, and the whole world just desperate for any good news. It's no wonder that study got a lot of attention.
Exactly. Plus, remember, things were moving so fast back then. Research on COVID was being published super quickly because everyone wanted answers as soon as possible. Sometimes, though, that meant things weren't checked as carefully as they should have been.
So it sounds like this study became a big deal really fast.
It did. It was in the news all the time. Even President Trump at the time was talking about it, saying how HCQ could be a game changer.
Wow. So everyone was talking about this study, and it probably felt like a breakthrough. But I'm guessing that's when things started to go wrong. Like people started questioning the research.
Yeah, pretty much as soon as the study came out, other scientists started pointing out problems with it.
Like what kind of problems?
Well, a lot of things, actually. For one thing, they were worried about the data itself, like if it was even accurate and if maybe it had been changed or manipulated in some way. And they also had questions about whether the researchers had gotten proper ethical approval to even do the study. And another big problem was that they didn't randomly assign the patients to different treatment groups, which is like super important in a study like this. And then there's this thing called equipoise, which basically means that the researchers have to be genuinely unsure which treatment is better when they're designing a study. And in this case, some scientists thought that maybe the researchers already believed that HCQ worked, and so they weren't really being objective.
Okay, hold on. You mentioned equipoise. Could you explain that a little more? It sounds like it's a really important concept in medical research.
Yeah, you're right. It is. Basically, it's about being fair and ethical when you're doing research with people. So equipoise means that if you're testing two different treatments in a study, you can't already believe that one is better than the other. You have to be genuinely unsure. Because if you already think one treatment works better, it's kind of unethical to even do the study, right? And with this HCQ study, some experts were worried because there wasn't a ton of evidence to say HCQ was a good idea to use for COVID, especially since it can have some pretty bad side effects.
So if there wasn't really strong evidence to support using HCQ for COVID in the first place and there were risks involved, that sounds like there were some serious ethical questions about this whole study.
Absolutely. And a lot of scientists were raising these concerns about the ethical stuff and also about the problems with how the study was designed. And one of the people who was really vocal about this was Elizabeth Bick. She's a scientific integrity consultant, and she's really good at spotting problems in research.
Oh, yeah, Elizabeth Bick. I remember her name. She was kind of like a detective for science, right? Always finding the things that didn't add up.
Yeah, exactly. And she did a really deep dive into this HCQ study, and she found a bunch of things that were concerning. Look, there were some weird things about the data, especially when it came to describing the patients in the study and the timeline for when they supposedly got ethical approval. It just didn't make sense. And she also pointed out that a lot of people who were taking HCQ in the study had to drop out, like they couldn't finish it, and some of them got really sick.
So not only were other scientists raising red flags, but people in this study were actually getting harmed.
Yeah, it was a pretty messy situation, and to make matters worse, it turned out that 3 of the researchers who worked on the study actually asked for their names to be taken off the paper because they were so worried about the problems with it.
Wow, even some of the study's own authors were like, wait a minute, something's not right here. That's pretty damning.
Yeah, it definitely doesn't look good. And this wasn't the first time that Didier Raoult, the lead researcher, had problems with his studies. He's actually had 27 other papers retracted over the years.
27? That's a lot of retraction.
Uh,
Like, seriously, how's that even possible? It makes you wonder how he was able to keep doing research for so long with that kind of track record.
Yeah, it is strange. But anyway, given all these issues with the study, you'd think they would have retracted it right away, right?
Yeah, that seems like the obvious thing to do, so why didn't they? What was the holdup?
Well, it's complicated. When a journal retracts a paper, it's a really big deal. It can damage the reputation of the researchers involved and even the journal itself, so they have to be really careful and make sure they have really good reasons. In this case, the journal that published the study, the International Journal of Antimicrobial Agents, was hesitant to retract it right away. They said they wanted to keep the conversation going, let scientists debate the findings and figure things out.
I can see that. Like, science is all about questioning things and having open discussions. But isn't there a point where, you have to prioritize protecting people from potentially harmful information?
Yeah, that's the tough part, finding the right balance. And in the end, there was just too much evidence against the HCQ study. The problems were too serious, and too many experts were raising concerns. So Elsevier, the company that publishes the journal, finally decided to retract the paper in December 2024 after doing their own investigation.
So after years of back and forth, the study was finally retracted. What exactly did they say in the retraction notice? Like, what were the official reasons they gave for pulling the paper?
Basically, they said that there wasn't enough proof that the researchers had actually gotten proper ethical approval before they started the study, which is a huge deal. Like, you can't just experiment on people without making sure it's ethical. And they also said they had some general concerns about how the whole study was conducted, like the methods and the data analysis, all that stuff.
So the investigation basically confirmed what a lot of people were already saying, that there were some fundamental problems with this study. But here's the thing that I find crazy. Even though the study was retracted, it's still super influential. Like, it's the second most cited retracted paper of all time. How is that even possible? Like, shouldn't a retracted study just disappear? Why are people still referencing it?
You'd think so, right? It's a weird phenomenon, but it happens more often than you might think. There are few reasons why this might happen. I mean, sometimes researchers might not even know that a paper has been retracted, especially if it was retracted a while ago.
Okay, that makes sense.
Or, maybe they cite the study because it's relevant to their own work, even if they know it has problems. And sometimes people might keep citing a retracted paper because it supports what they already believe, even if the evidence is flawed.
So it sounds like there are lots of reasons why a retracted study might still get cited, but it's still kind of unsettling that something that's been discredited can still have so much influence, especially in something as important as science.
Yeah, it definitely highlights a need for better ways to keep track of retractions and to make sure researchers know about them. I mean, we need to make sure people aren't basing their work on flawed research.
That makes sense. It also seems like scientists need to be really careful about what they cite and really think critically about the research, even if it's been published in a big fancy journal.
Right. We can't just assume that everything that's published is automatically true. We have to look at the quality of the research, too, not just how many times it's been cited.
It's like a reminder that science is always evolving, right? Like, we're constantly learning new things, and sometimes that means we have to revise what we thought we knew.
Exactly. It's all part of the process.
Okay, so this whole HCQ thing, all the hype around it, do you think that actually had a negative impact on the fight against COVID? Like, did it slow things down or maybe prevent people from getting the right treatment?
That's a tough question. It's hard to say for sure, but it's possible that all the focus on HCQ might have taken attention and resources away from other treatments that might have worked better.
That's kind of scary to think about. Like, what if we had been focusing on something else all that time, something that could have actually helped people more?
Yeah, it's definitely a possibility. And it just shows how important it is to get things right in science, especially when it comes to people's health.
So it seems like this whole story about the HCQ study and its retraction brings up this big question. How do we balance the need to find answers quickly, especially during a pandemic, with the need to be really careful and make sure the science is solid?
Right, it's a tricky balance. We need to find a way to move quickly without sacrificing accuracy.
So what can we do to make sure this kind of thing doesn't happen again?
Well, I think a big part of it is being more transparent and accountable in science, like
Yeah.
sharing data more openly so other researchers can check it, and pre-registering clinical trials so everyone knows what's being studied and how. And of course, we need really good peer review where experts carefully evaluate research before it gets published.
And it sounds like we all need to be smarter consumers of scientific information, right? Like, we can't just believe everything we read, especially if it sounds too good to be true.
Exactly. We need to be critical thinkers, look for evidence, and be willing to change our minds when new information comes along.
Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive into the HCQ study and all the controversy surrounding it. We've talked about the ups and downs of scientific research, the importance of being careful with information, and the fact that science is always evolving. And even though this study was ultimately retracted, it's kind of a good example of how science is supposed to work right. Like, mistakes happen, but eventually the truth comes out.
Exactly. The fact that the problems with this study were found and debated and ultimately led to its retraction shows that the system can work. It's a reminder that science is a process, not a perfect one, but one that's always striving for accuracy and truth.
Well said. And on that note, we'll leave you with this thought. Stay curious, keep asking questions, and never stop learning. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.